subject for today is fragility of the truth. Um, but in order to understand why we are here, we also need to understand where we come from. And you received the prize in economics back in 2001, and at that time you were very active in the discussion already back then in discussion about globalization. You wrote a book in 2002 on globalization and the discontents. So can you just take us back for a moment to that discussion, and let's see if there is a link to what you identified back then and the rise of populism and the kind of politics that we are now in?
Yeah, I think there is a link. One of the problems is that some of our political leaders oversold globalization. They said that everybody was going to be better off as a result of globalization. It didn't happen. And in fact, standards of living of many people got worse. To the point, just in the United States, the median income of a full-time male worker, and the ones who have full-time jobs are the lucky ones, of a full-time male worker in the United States are at the level that they were some 42 years ago. And the real wages at the bottom are the same level that they were 60 years ago. So the fact that they are doing very badly is unambiguous. And they were told that they perceive some of that as a result of globalization. There are other forces like technology, but globalization did play a role. And the fact that it did play a role means that if you have people, demagogues like Trump, so much easier to blame others for your problems than saying, we didn't do enough to help people adapt to the changes in technology. We didn't do enough to help those people who are facing stress. And so that's been where the dialogue went. It was to blame others. And this is how it fits into our discussion today. The fact that what the political leaders said was not correct.
It was not true.
Was not true. Undermined trust, not only in those political leaders, but in the elites and the institutions of the elites that seem to support that.
But they thought they were doing the right thing, or are you suggesting that they did it with the knowledge that it would hurt our societies?
That's a good question. There were some of us that were raising questions about what globalization was going to do to inequality. And for the most part, I think I was in the Clinton administration when some of these bad trade agreements were done. And I don't think that anybody thought they were going to have the magnitude of the adverse effects that they did. But we were aware that there was a problem, and we advocated what was called trade adjustment assistance. We realized that people were going to lose their jobs, and we argued that there needed to be assistance. But the Republicans consistently pushed back on that.
So that was the main problem, you think, with the policies, that we're not dealing with the adverse consequences of free trade, or what was really the problem? If you want to explain it.
It was deeper than that. I mean, what I'm saying, the people who were losing the jobs were the people who were the obvious sources. You know, they were feeling it front on. But the broader problem was that as we open up our markets, we put unskilled American workers in competition with unskilled workers from developing countries, from China. And economic science, if you want to use that word, economic science predicted that in that context, wages of unskilled workers in the United States would go down. So we knew that there were going to be these adverse effects. And this is where there was some dishonesty. Even though everybody should have known it, the political leaders ignored it, and most economists, particularly in the policy sphere, wanted to be on the train that was moving, and so their view was, well, somehow the economy will grow as a result, and the benefits somehow will trickle down. Theory did not have any evidence, theory to support that, but there was, I think, in this a little bit of praying, hoping, and a little bit of dishonesty.
So what would have been the right policy at the time, if you take us back 15 years, when this discussion was very much alive, and we saw movements also here in Europe, the attack movement that was, I mean, physically attacking the politicians that were in favor of globalization, not least here in Gothenburg in 2001.
Sure. So it would have entailed a new social contract where, uh, in a way, Sweden has managed this, and the Nordic countries have managed this better than almost anywhere else, because you had to be open. You were a small country. It would be inconceivable that you would close your borders. But to remain open and not to have a strong political backlash, you had to have some social contract of shared prosperity, okay? Some degree of shared prosperity. So that is the kind of framework that when needed, there are different ways of getting
Yeah.
it, but that's what should have happened in the United States, but didn't happen. So, but it was worse than that. One of the more contentious provisions of the recent trade negotiations, TTIP, the trade between the United States and Europe, was the investment agreements, and tens of thousands of people turned out against that. The object of those investment agreements is to worsen bargaining rights of workers in each country. What they did is to give American firms, say, investing abroad, more property rights abroad than they had in the United States. And the same symmetrically was true in Europe. Now, why would you want to do that? Why would countries with strong property rights? One of the big advantages that we had as a country is our strong system of rule of law and property rights. Why would we want Vietnam to have as strong protection as the United States? Well, very simple. It meant that American corporations could go to their workers and say, if you don't take a wage cut, we're going to move our factory to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we're going to be protected by a treaty and get more property rights than we have in the United States. And what do I mean by that? An example is, we're talking about climate change. If you change a regulation in the United States or in Europe that would require a firm to reduce its carbon emissions, it can't sue the government and say, oh, you're hurting my profits. But under the trade agreements, if you change the legal regulatory framework and profits go down, the company can sue the government. Sue the government for a regulation to protect the world or to protect health or safety. And this is not a hypothetical, this is not a hypothetical possibility. Philip Morris sued the Uruguayan government for regulations that it imposed, saying you had to disclose that cigarettes are bad for your health and they have plain wrapper. And the problem was these packaging regulations reduced the demand for cigarettes, hurt Philip Morris's profits, and Philip Morris, under these provisions, sued the Uruguayan government to compensate itself for the loss of profits. So in other words, these trade agreements say the right to kill is more important, or the right to profit is more important than the right to life.
So you see that the effects of the system, that it was basically rigged in favor of some U.S. corporations.
Exactly.
But here in Europe,
Oh, and European corporations, because
yeah,
you've been doing
but if you
some
look,
of the same
but if you look at incomes, for example, you talk about stagnated incomes in the U.S. for the middle class for decades now. But if you look at a country like Sweden, we have had income growths for broad groups now for the last 25 years. And still populism is on the rise here as well.
Well, part of the thing is, if you look at Europe as a whole, the middle class has not been doing well. I mean, Sweden is doing better than other countries, but inequality has been growing in Sweden.
But incomes are going up.
But incomes are going up. But in other countries, that's not true or is not as true. So it is not a surprise to me that people in Sweden, looking around the global landscape, say, we're protected now, but how do we know the future? You know, this is you might say a social contract, but a contract.
So the fear is true?
I think there is a real, and unless you really,
It's real. It's real. It's.
Oh, I
you think there is a reason to fear the future.
I think there's a reason to fear the future, unless you get institutions that really are committed to protecting. And this is where you see some of the controversy going on. So, for instance, the head of the ECB, Draghi, at one point, made an onslaught, strong criticism of welfare states. The interesting thing, there has never been a crisis caused by a country with too big of a welfare state. There has been a crisis caused by too big of a financial sector and an underregulated financial sector. And yet, it's always a strategy rather than talking. He's supposed to be running the financial system. Rather than talking about the failures to regulate the financial system, let's turn to talk about the failures of the welfare state. Well, it's not perfect, but there's never been a crisis caused by the welfare state. So the point is, there has been an attack on the welfare state. And if I were a worker in one of the welfare states, you worry if that attack is successful in the way the Trumpism has been successful, my security is undermined.
But still, in this country, the welfare state is alive and kicking.
Exactly. But you are one of the few.
Okay, the Nordic region at least. So if you're a politician now and you really care about the future of the liberal democracy, about science, respect for academic evidence, facts, how do you deal with this situation?
Well, I mean, if you're in this region, the Nordic, you have an advantage because you can see what's happening in the United States, and you can say that's not for us. You see a failed experiment and a divided society, and you say that's not the way we want to go.
Don't walk this way.
Don't go that way. And to say what we've learned from that experiment is a divided society gets more and more divided. You get more and more money in politics, which is one of the important lessons for democracies. Keep money out of politics. Make sure you support these institutions of truth-telling. And
who are they?
Well, among them are the press. And one of the things that, one of the concerns is that the way the press was supported, the business model of the press, has always been a fragile business model. It required advertising. It was not obvious that these marrying advertising and truth was a good marriage. And it had some problems, but it worked for a long time. But now it's not working because the social media, Google, Facebook, have drained all the advertising revenues. And one has to recognize that the press, free press, is a key institution in our democracy, is what I call a public good, and therefore has to be supported. So the Swedish TV is one of the few institutions of press around the world in which there's confidence and trust. And you may find that surprising.
Yeah.
But
No, it's still high, but it has been going down for all big media companies, not only in the US, but around the Western world. You see that in the surveys that are being conducted.
So I guess what I'm saying is one has to realize that it's going to need strong public support for a free press. And
you mean money?
Money, yeah, money.
By the government.
By government.
Public support.
Public support, and it's a public good. Our society cannot function without the check, and you might say part of a system of checks and balance of a free press. And
But can a press be free if it's supported with government money?
yes, and that was exactly what I was going to say. The
I'm
next,
sorry.
no, that just like I said, these things it could be abused. Government presses are in authoritarian regimes are used to bolster that, but in the UK, a free press works, and so you have to create institutions of oversight, civic participation, and one of the developments of, I'd say, last half century is the growth of civil society institutions. So I think we're actually in a better place to make institutions like a active free press, and including TV, viable in countries, strong countries, educated
So
countries
if,
like
if the
Sweden.
free press is such an important part of our societies and for democracy, why is there a crisis in confidence among parts, at least parts of society, don't trust these institutions anymore?
Well, I mean, you're part of a global uh, society, and in large parts of this global society, uh, the press has not earned our trust. And that goes back to what I said. If you have newspapers owned by Rupert Murdoch who see the press as a way of advancing their ideological positions, uh, lowering taxes, entertainment, but not fact based, not truth based, then of course it's going to lose trust. And so, and this goes also back to the notion that liars have an easier time than truth tellers. All our institutions are fallible and make mistakes. And the problem is that the liars are very good at exposing the mistakes of those who are trying to tell the truth and occasionally falter.
Is that new?
No, people. Well, but the magnitude, of somebody like Rupert Murdoch in being able to wage attacks. We have in the United States basically two national papers, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he owns one of those two, and so he has a vehicle for advancing a big platform. He also controls Fox News, one of the major TV stations. And it's absolutely clear, there's been actually good research showing how Fox News has affected people's beliefs and how they vote. And it has had consequences. So the bottom line of all of this is when you have media whose agenda is not truth-telling, but advancing a profits or advancing an ideological position, you're going to get a deterioration of the truth of confidence.
And that raises the question that you mentioned before. How does a liberal democracy deal with that kind of problem without becoming an illiberal democracy?
Yeah, that is really the challenge. How do you not go into the abuses as you try to protect yourself? And here, we focused before on one of the institutions of truth telling, which is the free press. There are others. Science, our institutions of science, our institutions of higher learning are also important institutions. And so, one of the things that as institutions of education, more important than sort of filling people's brains with particular knowledge is having them understand the distinction between what is true and what is not, what we mean by the science. So I think we have to do a better job in enhancing their ability of our citizens to differentiate between truth and non-truth. And if we do a better job, they will respond. I mean, I think one of the...
Are you optimistic in this respect?
Well, one of the problems in the United States is for the past third of a century, there's been an assault on public institutions, including education. And so there's been a defunding of education. If you look at what are called the PISA scores, these are there are standardized tests given across countries, and the United States, where one of the richest countries, performs really mediocre.
Yeah.
And so it's been a 30-year assault on our education institutions, undermining the ability of large fractions of Americans to make those critical distinctions.
Unfortunately, we Swedes can't brag about our results either. So,
and I do worry about the privatization of your education system.
Yeah, there is a big discussion about that here right now.
And there should be.
Let me just return. You mentioned two companies, and we have a couple of minutes left, and let's spend the time on them because they play such a huge role right now in our globalized, digitalized society, and that's Facebook and Google.
That's right.
Are they a problem or a solution?
No, I think they're a problem. They could be part of the solution, but right now their incentives are not focused on being part of the solution. Their incentives are to maintain their profits. And so, they have lots and lots of data. They know more than we do about what is going on. Did it really take a year to find out that Russia were polluting the campaign and sending messages out to more than half of Americans? No, they knew that right away. But it was not in their incentive to disclose it until it was very clear, probably, that our secret agents, the CIA or somebody else, would disclose it because they didn't want the criticism that would follow from that. So what they've constantly been saying is, yes, there's a problem, but government's not the solution. And it goes back a little bit the spirit is a little bit back to when we had all the controversies about textile manufacturers abusing human rights. And they said, oh, yes, but there's a problem, but leave it to us. Don't do any regulation because that'll make things even worse. And so that is the image that they're trying to do. Trust, but trust us because you can't trust the government.
But at the same time, they are not willing to solve the problem of fake news, for example, because they don't view themselves as media companies.
That's right. They don't.
So clearly, if something has to happen, they should be pressed to do it with regulation, or what should be done?
Well, I think they have to be regulated.
In what
basically.
way? In what way? So, what would you recommend a liberal democratic government to do, and not becoming illiberal?
Yeah. So I don't worry about Sweden becoming illiberal yet. Let me begin. There are some easy things, and there's some more difficult things. So some of the easy things are disclosure requirements. If you have a paid advertisement, you have to know who is paying you and disclose that when that message is being circulated. So you would then know when Americans are getting a message paid by a Russian or a Russian bot, they would know where it's coming from.
Pretty easy, check.
Exactly. That would be very easy. You could have systems of verification. If you make an assertion, you could have institutions that verify, and you would say, this has been verified, this has not been verified, this has been falsified. So that kind of information. You can slow down the speed with which information gets transmitted so that you don't get these cascades, the mobocracy that I talked about. There are lots of, the whole thing is how you trend, and that is how you manipulate the media. So the whole framework. So you could slow that down if you slowed it down by just a little bit. And Macron did that during the French election. That worked. So there's a whole variety of things that in the PowerPoint that I didn't have a chance to present, where I outline things that do not represent in any way a threat to...
It can be done.
That can be done. But there are stronger things. If they won't do it, there is a sense that this is a public utility. What we call a public utility is something that is a platform over which you have to operate, and public utilities probably should be, if they can't be well regulated, need to be publicly owned. So I think that public ownership has been, obviously, Facebook has an incentive to try to tell you that public ownership won't work. And they've been remarkably successful in that kind of propaganda. But I think there's absolutely no, today the technology was publicly developed. I think there are systems of checks and balances that would make a public utility work.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.